Hello and welcome to our eOrganic webinar on how to calculate pasture dry matter intake on your organic dairy farm. My name is Deb Haliba and I work at the University of Vermont Extension as eOrganic's Dairy Team Coordinator. eOrganic is an online community of more than 500 agricultural service providers and farmers who are providing science, experience, and regulation-based certified organic information on the web. Together we publish articles, videos, and other content at eextension.org. This webinar is part of an ongoing series focused on the Access to Pasture rule. Our first webinar, offered in March, featured Carrie Smith of the USDA National Organic Program describing the rule. We will continue our series this fall with 3 additional webinars. You can see more information about these webinars, find the recording of today's session, and view our other content on our website at www.extension.org/organic_production. Before we get started, I wanted to give a quick rundown of today's webinar. Sarah will give her presentation for about 45 minutes. Then we will ask you to respond to 3 quick poll questions that will pop up on your screen. Next, we will hold a question and answer session with Sarah. If you have a question, you can simply type it into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen and hit return. If you can't see the question box, click on the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. We will answer as many questions as we have time for. And finally, we ask that you respond to an email you will receive following the webinar to complete a follow-up survey. Okay, now I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Sarah Flack is a national consultant specializing in grass-based livestock farming and organic certification. She grew up on a farm in northern Vermont where she and her family grazed sheep, dairy and beef cattle, pigs, poultry, and goats. Sarah received her Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Agriculture and Biology and her Master of Science degree in Plant and Soil Science from the University of Vermont. She has more than 25 years of experience working with livestock farmers across the country interested in management-intensive grazing and/or certified organic farming. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Deb. So what I'm going to be talking about today is just a small piece of the whole new organic rule on pasture management. I'm only going to be speaking on how to calculate pasture dry matter intake on your dairy farm. And for those of you who are not dairy farmers, if you're beef farmers or sheep farmers or some other type of ruminant farmer, what we'll be talking about will be useful for you also, but my focus will be on the dairy farms today. So since we only have about 40 or 45 minutes to get through this material, I'm not going to get into all of the different parts of the new organic pasture rule. I'd encourage you to go look at one of the other webinars that has already been held or about to be held, or some of the other materials on the other websites that we'll be telling you about today as we go along. And that'll give you more information about all of the different parts of the pasture rule. But today I want to talk about just very briefly the pasture rule, and specifically where in the pasture rule the information about the dry matter intake calculations are found. And then we'll talk a little bit about what some of the things are that change the amount of dry matter that your animals will be able to get from pasture. And then we'll go into a little bit of detail about the 2 methods to calculate the amount of dry matter coming from pasture. One of those methods is the direct measurement of the pasture, where you go right out to the pasture and measure how much dry matter is out there. But mostly we will be talking about the subtraction method, and specifically how to calculate dry matter intake from pasture using this subtraction method. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll go into more detail about some of these additional resources so you can go find out how to learn more about the pasture rule and the subtraction method. So the new organic pasture rule is added into the already existing organic standards of the National Organic Program. And the pasture rule is added into several sections of the rule, and I just want to go through these briefly. First of all, there are a whole lot of new definitions in the definitions section of the rule, And I'd encourage you to read that section. We'll go through a few of those new definitions today, but there's a lot of new terms in there that apply to pasture. Then there's this whole new section that has been added. It's 205-240 in the rule, and that's the whole new pasture practice standard section. And that's the section that describes all the information you need to have in your grazing plan, in your pasture plan for your farm. And then 205-239 is the livestock living conditions section. And there have been some changes to this section, and in particular, one of the things I'll refer to today but won't have time to talk about is the exemptions. Those are the groups of animals that do not need to meet the pasture rule. These are animals that are such as your calves from 0 to 6 months of age that don't need to meet the rule. So that's another important section for you to read in the rule and understand. And then this section 205-237, which is the livestock feed section, this is the section where the changes include the detail on the additional records that you need to keep that will allow you to do the dry matter intake calculations using this subtraction method. So just a summary of the rule. The new pasture rule requires that ruminants be provided with pasture throughout the grazing season, and that the grazing season is going to be no shorter than 120 days, but it's going to be as long as 365 days, the full year, depending on where you are in the country, and even just regionally within states there will be variation in the grazing season. And the rule goes on to require that during the grazing season, ruminants can't get less than 30% of their dry matter intake from pasture. And that's an average of their dry matter intake over the whole grazing season. And just a reminder, the implementation timeline for this rule means that if you are an already certified farm, then likely you are not needing to meet the rule until June of next year. June of 2011 is when the full implementation of the rule comes in. So for you all, this year is your time to try things out, make sure your record-keeping system is up to snuff, improve or increase your pasture acres. But for folks who are new applicants, if you're applying now to get certified or just recently got your farm certified, then you need to meet this rule immediately. So this is the detail in the livestock feed section of the rule, 205-237. And specifically in section D of this, this is where all of the new record-keeping requirements for farmers for this rule are in detail about the types of feeding records that you need to keep. And these are the records that, once you're keeping these, this will include all of the information you need to do the dry matter intake calculation using the subtraction method. So what's required in this section is that for each type and class of animal, and we will talk about that in a little while, you need to include a description of their feed ration, and that the information also needs to include the home-raised feed, the feed produced on your farm, all of the feed that you buy from off the farm, and that's not new. Those are things that your organic inspector's been checking every year when they do your inspection likely. But then you also need to include the detail on the types of all of the feeds and amounts of all of the feeds that you're feeding. And you need to document the amount that you're actually feeding to the animals. And then this is even more detailed here. You have to document the changes that are made to those rations during the grazing season. Most of you probably have to feed a little bit more hay or change the amount of grain during the grazing season as the quantity and quality of pasture changes. And this needs to be documented. And we'll talk more about that in detail in a little while. And then finally, this rule also requires, number 4 here, that you provide the method for calculating the dry matter demand and the dry matter intake. So now just getting into a little bit more detail about this, the livestock feed dry matter intake needs to be calculated as an average over the grazing season, but it needs to be calculated separately for each type and class of animal. And generally on your farms, these are going to be the different feeding groups on your farm. So for example, you might have one group of bred dairy heifers that you have out on pasture during the grazing season that are getting a small amount of grain somewhere. Or you might have a group of younger heifers that are out on pasture but getting a larger amount of grain. And then you would have your milking cow group and possibly an additional dry cow group that are all being housed separately and fed different rations. So those would be different feeding groups, different types or classes of animals, and you'd have to do these dry matter intake calculations separately for each of those groups. In addition, if you have your dairy herd group, your milking group, if that is divided into subgroups, so say, for example, you have a freestall housing system and you have a high group and a low group of dairy cows, and you're feeding them different rations, keeping them in different sections of the freestall before they go out to pasture, you would need to do the dry matter intake calculation for those two groups separately. And the reason for that is that they don't want people to have one group that is getting under 30% and one group getting over 30%, and being averaged together coming out over 30%. They want each of those two subgroups to be meeting the minimum 30% rule. And then just a reminder that some of the animals on your farm are going to be exempt. So some of your close-up dry cows, some of the cows that just recently have had their calves, and then of course the calves up to 6 months are just some of the animals that are exempt from having to meet the pasture rule. And there's a full list of all of those animals that are exempt in the housing in the 205-239 in the rule that you should take a look at. So why are we going to keep talking about everything on a dry matter basis? The reason is that it puts all of the feeds on an equal basis amount so that the amount of nutrients from each of those feeds can be known, and then you can compare rations and evaluate rations more accurately. And then most importantly is the organic rule. All of these new pasture standards are based on dry matter and dry matter calculations. So now let's look at a few definitions of terms that we'll be using during the webinar today. Dry matter is simply the weight of the feed with all the moisture taken out of it. So feed records will be either on an as-fed basis, which is the feed with the water still in it, or on a dry matter basis, which is the weight of the feed once you subtract the weight of the water from it. Then dry matter intake, which gets shortened up to DMI, is the amount of dry matter being eaten by either an animal or a group of animals. And then dry matter demand, that gets shortened up to DMD, is the expected or predicted amount of dry matter intake that either an individual animal or a group of animals is predicted to be eating. And we're going to get into more detail about all of these definitions as we go on. One more definition here. This is a new one in the rule, dry matter fed. This is the amount of dry matter that's being fed that includes everything other than what's being grazed out in the pasture. So this would be the dry matter from grain, hay, and silage and things like this. And also, there's an additional term in here that is newly defined in the new organic pasture rule, which is residual forage. And I just want to point this out to people that the dry matter from pasture includes the pasture that is rooted in the pasture, the stuff that's still attached to its roots and growing out there in the pasture. But it also includes this residual forage, which for the purposes of the organic standards has been defined as the forage in the pasture that has been clipped and left in place to wilt. And so this is a practice that's done in some parts of the country where clipping the pasture and letting it wilt for a few hours or a half a day before grazing increases the palatability of the plants. And as long as that material is left right there in the same pasture, right where it was clipped, that counts as pasture dry matter intake. But if you clip it and bring it into the feedlot or into the barn and feed it, then it's considered green chop and it no longer counts as pasture. So I encourage you to go to the definition section of the rule. Also, there's a good article summarizing all of these new pasture-related definitions that's on the eOrganic website that you can download. So now getting started with the steps that we go through to do these dry matter intake calculations. The first thing that you need to do on the farm is determine what are all of the different animal groups that you need to do this calculation for. So generally, these are going to be the different feeding groups on your farm. Then the next thing you want to do is determine what the length of the grazing season is expected to be in your region and more specifically on your farm. And next year, when you're filling out your organic OSP, Organic System Plan, or application that your certifier will send you, there'll be additional questions that will help walk you through the process of answering these questions and figuring these things out on your farm. But I'd encourage you to start figuring it out now and not wait till you get your application in the mail during the winter or the spring. So then next, we're going to calculate the amount of dry matter intake from pasture for each of these groups. And then each time the ration changes during the grazing season, we're going to recalculate the amount of dry matter intake from pasture. And then we're going to take the average over the whole grazing season. Then once you've done that, you can look at each of those animal groups and make sure that they are each averaging over 30% during the grazing season. So there are a lot of different things that will either increase or decrease the total amount of dry matter that the animals can get from the pasture. These include pasture quality, as the quality of the pasture declines by increasing amounts of fiber and decreasing digestibility. For example, if you let your pasture get over mature so that a lot of seed heads form, that pasture is going to be less digestible, lower quality, and the lower digestibility is going to limit the amount of dry matter that the animals can eat from that. They'll be able to eat less pasture if it's less digestible. Then pasture density is how closely together the plants are or how spread apart the plants are. If you have a low density pasture, for example, it's just grasses with no legumes and you can see bare soil between the plants, then each time the cow takes a bite, she's going to get less forage per bite, and it's going to be harder for her to fill her rumen and maximize the amount of dry matter intake from pasture. Then pasture height is very similar to the pasture density. A shorter pasture, it's going to be harder for the cow to get a full mouthful with each bite, and that's going to limit her ability to take in dry matter. Then also the type and the quantity of the supplemental feed being fed will change the amount of pasture that they're willing to eat or able to eat. For example, if you feed the cows a lot in the barn, then obviously when they go out to pasture, they're going to be full and they're going to eat less pasture. But it's even more interesting than that. The type of feed that you feed can also limit their desire to eat out in the pasture. For example, if you feed them a high-protein ration with soybeans in it or a high-protein haylage, for example, when they go out to a pasture that's a high-protein, high-quality pasture that's a mix of grasses and legumes, they're not going to be interested in eating that high-protein pasture. They're going to be looking for energy sources. Whereas if you feed more energy, such as corn or barley or something like that in the barn, that will encourage them to want to eat more of that high-protein pasture when they go out to graze. So then the pasture management system itself will also have a big impact on the amount of dry matter that the animals are able to harvest from the pasture. And there will be some additional webinars focusing on these topics coming up. There'll be one on maximizing dry matter intake from pasture, and there'll be one on how to design a pasture management system so that you don't need to use as many acres of land to provide high-quality feed. There'll also be some articles on the eOrganic website on those topics. So now we're going to talk about some of the methods to calculate dry matter intake from pasture. And the two methods that people are using are direct measurement of the pasture, where you actually go out and measure how much grass is out there. And then the other method is this subtraction method that we'll be talking in more detail about in this webinar. So direct measurement of the pastures is something that I do anytime I'm doing grazing consulting with a farm. We'll go out to the pasture, measure how much is out there, measure how much they're leaving behind when they leave the paddock, and then the difference between what was there when they went in, what they left behind, is that that's the amount that they're harvesting or grazing from the pasture. And so doing these direct measurements of the pasture is going to be really helpful for you on your farm in determining things like how big should your paddocks be, how many acres do you need to provide all the dry matter that you want to get into your animals. And if you're doing these measurements and keeping records of them, they are another way to prove to your inspector or your certifier that you're meeting the rule. This method of doing the direct measurement is not required by the organic standards. It's just one of the methods that you can use. And most of the certifiers and inspectors are using the subtraction method, and all of those records that you need to keep in order to do the subtraction method are still required. So most farmers are thinking of these direct measurements as something that they're doing in addition to the requirements of the organic pasture rule. So some of these methods of direct measurement, one of the more accurate, but probably one of the more time-consuming methods, is actually to go out into the pasture and do a clipping, where you clip an area of the pasture, a known number of square feet or square inches. You dry it, and then you weigh it, and there's a formula so that you can then multiply that out and determine how many pounds of dry matter is there per acre. Then you can also use a couple of different types of electronic meters. There are electronic capacitance meters, pasture probes, and rising plate meters, all of which are digital and will give you a readout of how much dry matter is there per acre. Then grazing sticks are definitely the lowest tech, least cost method, and I'll just show you that one in the next slide. All of these methods require some training, and the most common mistake I see from the direct measurement method is that you tend to overestimate the actual amount of really good grazable forage that is in the pasture with some of these methods. But it's still a really helpful method, and I'd encourage folks to learn about it. So this is a photo of me just demonstrating the use of a grazing stick. I'm not going to explain how to use the grazing stick during this webinar, but there is a video on the eOrganic website which shows you how to use one of these grazing sticks. And then I believe that Deb Haliba has also posted an article listing a lot of the different places that you can go around the country to get these grazing sticks, because they're a little bit different in different types of forages, different parts of the country. But this is certainly the easiest way to measure the amount of dry matter available per acre. So I also wanted to mention that there's a very useful article on the National Organic Program website, and this is a link that you can use to get to this article. It's called Pasture Worksheet for Rotational Stocking Systems, and it includes 2 tables that can help you get a rough estimate. It won't be as accurate as direct measurement, but it'll help you get an estimate of how much available grazable dry matter there is per acre in your pastures, so that you can start sizing your paddocks and determining how many acres that you need to have in your grazing system. So just a reminder, if you're doing these direct measurements of your pastures, and you can keep records of these will be extra information that you can show to your inspector to make sure that they can understand that you are meeting the pasture rule when they come around either this year or next year to do your inspection. But most people are going to be using the subtraction method, which is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the webinar. And I just want to mention that a lot of certifiers either already have or are going to be sending farmers forms to do these subtraction method calculations. Some of these are already in the OSP or application that you fill out each year, or it'll be a supplemental page that you'll be sent. So here are the 4 basic steps involved in doing the dry matter intake calculation using the subtraction method. First of all, you're going to determine the dry matter demand, and again, that is the predicted amount of dry matter that an individual animal or a group of animals that you're doing this calculation for is going to eat in a day. Next, you're going to determine the amount of dry matter from feed sources other than pasture. So this would be the amount of dry matter being fed from the grain, the hay, the silage, or the other stored feeds. The third step is then to determine the amount of dry matter from pasture by subtracting the dry matter from feed fed from the total dry matter demand. And then that will give you a number in pounds that is the estimated amount of dry matter that the animals are getting from pasture. And then you can use that number in pounds to go on to calculate the percentage of dry matter intake from pasture. So we'll go through at least one example during the webinar on how to do that, but we'll go through each of these steps in more detail now. So first we're going to talk about dry matter demand. And one of the things that's important to know about dry matter demand is that it really does vary. Dry matter demand, again, is the amount of dry matter that an animal or group of animals is predicted to eat. And it's usually given in pounds per day, per head. And it's going to vary as the animal's stage of production things like level of milk production, the animal's size, or body condition changes. And so, for example, a cow that's making a lot more milk than another cow will also likely be eating a lot more dry matter intake than a cow making less milk. Other things that make dry matter demand change is environment, including the temperature where the animals are, the feeding system, and the housing system. And then the feed ration will also change the amount of actual dry matter demand or dry matter intake. The quality and digestibility of the forages, as we were talking about before, as that changes, that will increase or decrease the total amount of dry matter the animals are eating. And then the amounts and types of other supplemental feeds other than the forages will also change their actual amount of dry matter intake. So there are a couple different ways that most people are figuring out what the dry matter demand is for the different groups of animals on the farm. The method one of the two methods that you can use is to use the actual amount of dry matter that you're feeding to that group of animals during the non-grazing season. So then you would actually be adding up the total pounds of dry matter you're feeding per head per day to that group when they're not out on pasture and they're getting 100% stored feed from grain and hay and silage. This system does work as long as there are not big changes in the dry matter demand between the grazing season and the non-grazing season. So an example of a farm that this would not work on would be a seasonal dairy farm where the cows are dried off during the winter, because that would mean that in the winter months the dry matter demand of those cows that are not making any milk would be significantly lower than their dry matter demand during the summer grazing months, when they would be eating a lot more dry matter while they're out on pasture because they're making milk then. So if you do decide to use the non-grazing season dry matter intake number as your dry matter demand number, it's a good idea to check it against the NRC tables, which we'll be talking about next. And one of the reasons is just to make sure that you're correct, and also it's a good thing to be familiar with these NRC tables, because your inspector, when they come next year to do your inspection, or even this year, they're likely going to be checking your dry matter numbers against one of these tables to make sure that it's accurate. So the other way to figure out what the dry matter demand is from one of these tables. And NRC stands for the National Research Council. And these tables are now available on the NOP website, and we'll give you the link to go there if you want to download those tables. And the NOP right now has a table for dairy animals, including all your heifers and dry cows and lactating animals. They also have a table for all of the different types of beef animals. And then for those of you with small ruminant animals, sheep and goats, we'll show you some links at the end of the webinar where you can go to get dry matter demand tables for them. So if you're using one of these tables, and we'll look at some next, you're going to be given the information on a % of body weight basis, or on just in pounds or kilograms if you're in Canada. So this is an example of one of the dry matter demand tables that's available on the National Organic Program website. This one is for small breed dairy cows. So for those of you with jerseys, you would use this table. This particular table is for cows making between 22 and 66 pounds of milk per day. And the way that you use this table is we'd use this column, which is in pounds of milk per cow per day. And if we wanted to look at a Jersey that's making 44 pounds of milk per day, we would look at this number here. This cow is predicted to be making 4.5% fat. If your cows are making less fat, you'd use one of these numbers on either side. But if this cow's making 4.5% fat, 44 pounds of milk, this table is predicting that the cow is eating 36.38 pounds of dry matter per day. So if you have a group of cows, of Jerseys, and they're on average making 44 pounds of milk, then this would be the number that you would use. Now let's look at one of the other tables on the NOP website. This next table that we're going to look at is for Holsteins or any of the other larger breed dairy cows. The larger animals, their dry matter demand is higher, and so they need a separate table. So this one's for the large breed cows making between 55 and 99 pounds of milk per day. And so we go down here if we want to look at a Holstein herd that is making 55 pounds of milk at 3.5% fat. That group of animals is predicted to be eating 44.75 pounds of dry matter per day, per cow per day. So some of the certifiers are including simpler, easier to use dry matter demand tables in their OSPs, in their application that they're sending out to farmers each year. And this is one that is being put in the application by MOSA, which is one of the Midwest certifiers. And this has all of the information for both the small breed and the large breed animals on one table. So this is the average milk production in the pounds of milk per cow per day. So you would take the average for either the whole dairy herd if they're in one group, or for each group separately if they're in multiple groups. And then you would go across. So let's look at a cow making 45 pounds of milk. And if it's a Jersey making 45 pounds of milk, this is the small breed column, predicted to be eating 33 pounds of dry matter per day. And the large breed animal, so this would be a Holstein, would be predicted to be eating 37 pounds of dry matter per day. And then this is an example. Again, this is one of MOSA's tables. This one is for the dry cows, the heifers, and the other non-dairy animals that might be on the farm. In this case, they're giving these numbers as a percent of body weight. And so if we looked at this bred dairy heifer group, this is the group of animals that are probably 14 to 24 months. This table is predicting that that group of animals is going to be eating 2.5% of their body weight in dry matter each day. And so you would take the average weight of an animal in that group, multiply it times 2.5%, and that would be the predicted dry matter intake per animal in that group. So now we're going to talk about how to figure out how much dry matter is coming from feed sources other than pasture. So this is figuring out what the dry matter intake from feed fed is. So if you're working with a nutritionist, all of this is going to be quite a lot easier, because they're probably going to be providing you with a ration sheet which shows you the actual pounds of dry matter from feed fed, being fed per head per day generally is how the information will be presented to you. They'll probably also be giving you the dry matter demand numbers. If you're not working with a nutritionist, or if you're feeding a different amount of feed than the nutritionist is recommending, so you've got the nutritionist sheets but you're actually not feeding as much as the nutritionist tells you to, then you will actually need to do these calculations yourself. And I'll just say before we get into this section that this is the section of the calculations that most of the farmers I've worked with find to be the most confusing. And if you're really confused by this section, you may need to work with a nutritionist or with the person who sells you your hay or grain, or with someone from Extension or a consultant, and have them help you figure out how to do this calculation. Because what you're trying to figure out here is the total pounds of dry matter from grain and hay and silage and other stored feeds that you're feeding per head per day. Most of the feed information that you'll have on hand is going to be on an as-fed basis, which is the weight of the feed with the water still in it. And so you need to do the conversion of the as-fed to a dry matter basis. And we'll do an example of one of those next. And then also the information is very likely going to be in a per group basis, or sometimes even in a per week or per month basis, depending on which group of animal and what feeding system you're using. So in order to do the calculations the way that we're going to do them in this webinar is you're going to need to convert those numbers over to a per head per day basis. Now I will say it is possible to do these dry matter intake calculations on a per group basis. You don't always have to convert it over to a per head basis. But for the sake of doing it consistently, we're just going to do everything on a per head basis today, because that's the way the numbers are presented in those dry matter demand tables. So it's usually a lot easier to do it this way. So you may need to add up the total weight of hay in the number of bales that you're feeding to your herd each day, and then divide that out by the number of animals to get the weight per head per day. For those of you feeding a TMR during the grazing season, you'll need to figure out how many pounds of each ingredient you're feeding each day, and then divide that by the number of animals in the group to get the pounds per head per day of each of those ingredients. So now let's talk about how to figure out what the dry matter content of each of these types of feeds are, because you're going to probably have this information on an as-fed basis, and you need to first convert it to a dry matter basis. The most accurate source of information is always going to be the feed tests themselves, those forage tests that you have done that come back and tell you the nutritional content of the feed. One of the numbers on the top of the list of numbers that they give you is going to be the dry matter content of that feed. If you don't have the dry matter test from a forage test, then you're going to need to use something, one of the numbers from one of the general tables of assumptions, and we'll show you some of those next. Also, if you've got grain and it's a pelleted or a mash grain from a feed mill, they're probably going to put the dry matter content information of that grain right on the feed tag information that they give you. So those you generally don't have to test unless they're homegrown grains or grains you're buying just from a farmer somewhere. So this, again, is one of the helpful tables that MOSA is using in their application. This is the tables that they're recommending that farmers use if they don't have numbers from forage tests. And so they're listing all these different types of feeds, and then they're giving an average dry matter content of this. So for this one, they're saying for haylage, which is ensiled grass or a grass legume mix, that they're saying the average number to use is 35% dry matter. So you can see if you're putting up haylage that's significantly drier or wetter than this, this will be a less accurate way to do it, but it does give you a number to use to start with. Now, for those of you who are balancing rations that are very close to not quite meeting the pasture rule, the 30%, if you're balancing a ration where you're getting only 30 to 40% dry matter intake from pasture, those are the farms where you're going to want to pay extra attention to making sure that you've done the math really, really correctly, and you may want to put some energy into testing all of your forages so you've got really accurate numbers so that the inspector and certifier can't call your dry matter intake calculations into question. Whereas those of you who are way over 30%, those of you who are feeding 70 to 100% dry matter intake from pasture, you've got a little bit more wiggle room in these calculations. You still want to check your math and make sure you're meeting the rule. So here's an example ration where we're going to do the conversion to convert it from an as-fed to a dry matter basis. This is a Holstein herd being fed a total mixed ration. They have a freestall system, and this is a winter ration, so they're not getting any dry matter from pasture during the non-grazing season here. The ration here, what I've done is I've made a list of all of the different ingredients in the feed, and then next to that I've made a list of how many pounds of feed on an as-fed basis, so this is with the weight of the water in it. Each of those feeds are being fed per head per cow. And then we've made a list here of the dry matter content of each of those feeds. In this case, the farmer was actually testing their forages, and so they knew that their haylage was really 46% dry matter. And so for the haylage, then they've taken the 50 pounds of haylage on an as-fed basis, multiplied it times 0.46 to get 23 pounds of dry matter from haylage. And then we've gone ahead and done that for all of these different feed ingredients in this total mixed ration. So there's 4.5 pounds of dry matter from dry hay, 7.12 pounds of dry matter from the cornmeal, 10.56 pounds of dry matter from this small grain mix the farmer was growing right on the farm. And we add all of those numbers together, and this is the total dry matter from feed fed. So this is the winter, they're getting 100% of their dry matter intake from feed fed because it's not during the grazing season. We'll do an example in a little while looking at the dry matter intake from feed fed during the grazing season. I'm just waiting for my slide to switch here. Oh, I think for some reason I just went 2 slides. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start running through an example calculation where we're going to do all of the 4 steps to do the dry matter intake calculation using the subtraction method. And so step number 1 is to determine what the dry matter demand is. And I want to mention that the example that we're running through is from a very helpful article on the National Organic Program website. This is a different article than the last one. It's an article called Calculating Dry Matter Intake from Pasture, and this is the example in there, and they go through it in a lot more detail than I have time to go through here. So if you want to download that, it's free, and you can read through it to understand the steps a little bit more. So in this example, this is a group of dairy cows that weigh an average of 1,200 pounds, and the dry matter demand, which is the predicted dry matter intake in this example, is predicted to be 3% of their body weight in dry matter intake per day. So they're using a dry matter demand table that predicts dry matter intake as a percent of body weight. And so for step 1, we're going to calculate the dry matter demand per head in this group of cows. So we know that their average body weight is 1,200 pounds. We're going to multiply that times 0.03, which is 3%. And so they are predicted to be eating 36 pounds of dry matter intake total. That's their total predicted dry matter intake. So now we'll use that number later on as we go through this example. My internet connection seems to be slowing down a little bit. There it goes. Okay, so step 2 is to determine what the dry matter intake from feed sources other than pasture is. And in this example, they're being fed 5 pounds of hay and 11 pounds of grain, in addition to the pasture. And so what we need to do next is determine how much of that is, we're going to convert that from an as-fed basis over to a dry matter basis. So I've put this into a table format very similar to the Holstein non-grazing season example where we were looking at the TMR before, where I've made a column of the feed ingredients, and then I've made a column of how many pounds of each of those ingredients are being fed on an as-fed basis. Then we're going to multiply each of these numbers by the dry matter content of those feeds. And in this example, the hay is 90% dry matter, and the grain is 89% dry matter. So there's 4.5 pounds of dry matter from hay, 9.79 pounds of dry matter from grain. We add those two numbers together, and this is 14.29 pounds of dry matter from feed fed. So this is the dry matter being fed from sources other than pasture. So next we're going to calculate the amount of dry matter that is estimated to be coming from the pasture. And this is the subtraction step, where now that we have figured out the dry matter demand, so this is the amount that the animals are predicted to be eating from pasture, and this is the amount that they have measured as being fed in the barn from hay and grain, 14.29. So we're just going to subtract 14.29 from 36, and that's going to give us 21.71. So this is the estimated amount of dry matter in pounds that this farm is predicting that they're getting from pasture. And so in the next step, we're going to calculate what that is in a percentage dry matter intake from pasture. So converting this over to a percentage dry matter intake from pasture is done by dividing the estimated amount in pounds from pasture by the total dry matter demand, and then multiplying times 100. And this is one of the steps where all of us often do this backwards. And I always try to remind myself to do it the right way by saying you divide the part by the whole and multiply times 100. You don't want to divide the whole by the part. It's the part by the whole. So the part is the pounds from pasture, 21.71. We're going to divide that by 36, which is the dry matter demand, and multiply times 100. And in this case, this dry matter intake calculation is showing that this farmer is getting 60.31% dry matter intake from pasture when this calculation is done. And just to remind you, you're doing this calculation at the beginning of the grazing season, and then you're going to do it again each time you change the ration enough so that the amount of dry matter coming from the pasture increases or decreases. And then you're going to be averaging those numbers over the whole grazing season. So this is just one dry matter intake calculation for one group of animals. So I just wanted to discuss what you want to do if you have a group of animals or perhaps several groups of animals on your farm which are getting 100% of their dry matter intake from pasture during some or all of the grazing season. So it's very likely that many of you have a group of dry cows or heifers or beef animals, or in some cases, some of you might even have lactating cow groups that are out on pasture and getting all of their nutritional needs met out on the pasture. For the lactating cow group, that'll mean you've got to have really high quality pasture and really good grazing genetics in your herd, but I certainly do see it done. The bad news for those of you doing this is you still need to keep the records and you still need to do these dry matter intake calculations because of the way the rule is written. Everybody's required to do it for each group. However, it's going to be pretty easy because what you need to do is you need to do one calculation at the beginning of the grazing season. So in this case, you would need to determine what the dry matter demand is, and then from that you would subtract the dry matter from feed fed, which in this case would be 0 because you're not feeding any dry matter from feed fed. And then you would then come up with a calculation that shows 100% of your dry matter intake is from pasture. But you still need to keep those records. You'll want to keep some grazing records of when you turn out at the beginning of the grazing season. You'll want to keep records if at some point during the grazing season you do need to feed some additional bales of hay or something like that, or if you need to feed some grain to one of the groups of animals. And then take the average over the whole grazing season. If you don't change your ration during the grazing season, then you don't need to redo the calculation. So just to go over the averaging process, because this is another part of the rule that's a little bit confusing, and honestly some of the certifiers are still figuring out how to do this, and when we get to the end of this year's grazing season, I think we'll get a lot more clarification from certifiers on some tables and perhaps some useful worksheets that farmers can use to do this averaging calculation. But in general, the way you're going to average these dry matter intake numbers over the whole season is to do the pasture dry matter intake calculation at the beginning of the grazing season. And then if you are feeding that same ration throughout the entire grazing season for a group of animals and you never change that ration, you do not need to do the calculation again. If you do change your ration during the grazing season so that the amount of dry matter from pasture is changing, then you need to do this calculation each time it changes and then take that average over the whole grazing season. And I just want to remind people also, make sure you check with your certifier to make sure that you're meeting all of their record-keeping requirements. This pasture rule is new, and the certifiers and inspectors and farmers, we're all trying to figure out how to make it work. And there are some different areas that are being interpreted differently by different certifiers. They're fairly minor differences of opinion at this point, but it is really important to stay in close communication with your certifier to make sure that you are meeting their requirements.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi. I'm trying to get into the webinar.
Alice, could you help with that, please? So just going on with the record keeping, the ration change records are going to be required. They're one of the things required in 205-237, and these are the records of each time you need to change your ration, and it's changing the amount of dry matter coming from pasture. And I'm seeing farmers keep these in a whole lot of different ways, some of which are easier and some of which are more challenging. And a lot of the complexity in these records will depend on how complicated the feeding system is on your farm. I've certainly seen quite a few farmers keeping these records right on a wall calendar in the barn. Things as simple as writing how many pounds of each type of feed is being fed, or how many pounds of each ingredient is being put in the mixer wagon for a TMR. Then some of the certifiers are already sending out ration change forms, which you can use to keep track of the number of pounds of each ingredient each time you change the ration. And then for those of you working with a nutritionist, the nutritionist's ration sheets, you can just save those, put the date on them, write which group you were feeding them to, and you might also want to write the number of animals that were in the group at the time that you were feeding that ration. The important thing with these ration sheets is if you're feeding more or less than the nutritionist is recommending, you need to keep the record of what you're actually feeding. And then, of course, there's also notebooks that you can keep these grazing records in. And then the other record system that I'm seeing that's working really well is for people who are doing holistic planned grazing. I'm seeing them keep their grazing records and their feed records all together on the same sheet, which works really well. So I'm going to go through additional resources, and then we're going to open it up for questions afterwards. And just a reminder that you can type your questions in the little question box on the side of your screen there. So some of the additional resources for where you can go get more information and more detail on the things that I've been going through today. The National Organic Program website, this is this first link up here, has a whole collection of useful articles, fact sheets, and also has dry matter demand tables for both dairy animals and for beef animals. And I'll give you some links for those of you with sheep and goats where you can get dry matter demand tables for them. And there's also, on there, there's a list of frequently asked questions about the pasture rule. There's an article called Calculating Dry Matter Intake from Pasture, which is where the example calculations that we did during this webinar came from. And then there's also another article that has the setting up a grazing system dry matter estimating tables in it. For those of you who are looking for more information on the dry matter content of the feed, so you can do these calculations, these next two links will get you to dry matter content tables. And then there are more dry matter content tables available on the various extension websites for your state, and those may get you the best, most relevant dry matter content numbers for the types of feeds that are being used in your area of the country. And then there's also a lot of articles on this eOrganic website, as well as links to future and past webinars and videos that you can watch. For those of you looking for more information on dry matter demand tables, there's a table on the UC Davis website that does dairy dry matter intake. Some of the certifiers, as I mentioned, are providing dry matter demand tables. And then there are those tables on the National Organic Program website. For those of you with sheep or goats who are looking for dry matter demand tables, these next two links will give you some tables for those small ruminant animals. And just a reminder to always check with your certifier to make sure that you're keeping all of the required records. And I believe that gets us to the questions section, which I think either Deb or Alice will take over here.
Thank you, Sarah. So we are going to move, before we move to our question and answer session, we'd like to ask you to complete 3 very quick poll questions. So on the screen right now, you'll see a question, and if you could just click on one of the little circles by the responses, that would be great. So this question says, as a result of this webinar, do you understand how to calculate the amount of dry matter livestock get from pasture? So if you could just select one, that would be great. Each one of these questions will be up for about 20 seconds, so if you could be quick, and that way we can get to our Q&A session. Whoops, somehow we're losing the polls. There we go, number 2, great. So number 2 is, will you apply the calculations you learned during today's webinar on your farm or in your work with farmers? You can just click on one of those responses, And we will move on very quickly to our third and final quick poll question. Here we go. There's a little bit of a lag, it looks like. Quick poll number 3. There it is. So number 3, do you know what resources are available to help you learn about and or make decisions regarding the access to pasture rule? And if you could just, again, once more, click on one of those responses, and then we will start our Q&A session. And as we're finishing up, I'm just going to remind folks how to post questions. We are going to be using the question box or question pod for our Q&A session. So for those of you who missed the beginning of the presentation, all you need to do is, if you use the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, you just type in your question and hit return. And if for some reason that question box is closed, you can just click on the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. And I'll be reading the questions out loud to Sarah, and she'll get to as many questions as we have time for. And if after the webinar you have additional questions, or if we don't have time to get to your questions, you can use our online Ask an Expert system at eextension.org/ask, and I think the URL is up there on the website now. Okay, so I'm just looking at our questions now. So Sarah?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. So the first question is about the direct measurement of pasture. You had mentioned that there are several different ways to do that. The question that's being asked is, it looks like it's about the clipping method, and it says, what kind of chunk do you take to weigh or to represent an acre?
Great. So that's a great question, and it's probably a longer answer than I can give you. I have several different methods that I have used for doing that, and different states have different numbers on some of the state recommendations on how to do that clipping system. That's probably something I should post on the eOrganic website. We should probably make a little quick question answer or something like that and embed a bunch of the links to the websites where you can go to get that information, because depending on which system you use, some of them are much more complicated where you have a long formula. There's another one that I believe some farmers in Oregon are using where they're clipping a fairly small area and then just multiplying it times a very simple number, and it immediately converts into pounds of dry matter per acre. And the other thing I will say about that clipping method is that it's going to give you a measurement of the total amount of dry matter that's out there depending on how you do the clipping. So usually you need to do a clipping measurement before you graze and after you graze, and then the difference is what they've actually eaten, and that'll give you the amount of dry matter available to graze per acre. There are also clipping methods where you clip as if you're a cow. You basically go out into the pasture, pretend you're a cow, and clip from a certain area, dry that and weigh that, and that gives you the actual amount that the cows are able to harvest. So I realize I'm not specifically answering your question. I'm answering it generally, but we'll post some links on the eOrganic website so you can go and get more detail on exactly how many square inches or square feet you want to clip and how to dry it and other information on that.
So while we're on the topic of direct measurement, there's a question about the demonstration of the video demonstrating the grazing stick. And so for that questioner, they wanted to know where that's located on the web. So we have two places where it's located right now. eOrganic actually has its own YouTube site, so you can find it there. If you can just Google or when you're on YouTube, you can just click in eOrganic and you can see the whole listing of videos we have. And/or it's also on our main website. The URL is listed right there, the first one under questions. So you know, this webinar is going to be recorded and available there, but also our video is up there as well under the dairy production piece. And, and the audio text is provided with that, and the link to where to find a pasture sticks in your area. Okay?
And I'll just add to that, Deb, that the other things that are already available on that same section of the eOrganic website is the National Organic Program did a webinar for eOrganic on the pasture rule, which would help put today's webinar in context, because today I really just had time to very briefly overview a small segment of the rule. If you want to know more about the whole rule, that webinar is posted there, available for you to watch. And then there's 2 upcoming webinars that are relevant to things that I spoke about today very briefly but didn't have time to get into detail. One is there's going to be a webinar on how to maximize dry matter intake from your pastures. And then there'll be another one that I'm doing, I think, on October 1st, right, which is going to be on how to set up a grazing system so that you can get as much dry matter as possible out of your pastures and not have to use as many acres.
So just to reiterate, so on our next webinar as part of the series is happening on September 16th. That one's going to feature Karen Hoffman from USDA NRCS, who will be addressing the maximizing dry matter intake from your organic dairy pastures. And then, as Sarah said, on October 1st, she's going to come back and be joined by Cindy Daly of California State University at Chico to address setting up a grazing system. Okay?
And John is posting links in the little chat box. I think everybody can see that, so that you can click on those if you want to go directly to those sections of the eOrganic website to see those things.
Perfect, perfect. Okay. So a question about the subtraction method, Sarah. I'm just going to read her her question verbatim. Did you say that you can do the subtraction method even if the animals are 100% on pasture?
Yeah, what I said in that section is that you still have to do the calculation if they're 100% on pasture, or at least keep all of the same records, because the record keeping requirement is the same regardless of how much dry matter the animals are getting from pasture. And so essentially that dry matter intake calculation is going to be very simple if they're on pasture. It's going to be the dry matter demand, which you'll figure out, and then from that you'll subtract the dry matter from feed fed, which is going to be 0, and then obviously the number is going to be 100% dry matter intake from pasture. And it does seem a little silly to have to keep the records and do it the same way if the animals aren't getting any dry matter other than pasture, but the way the rule is written, it does seem that you do still need to keep all of those records.
Okay. Are the calculations the same for sheep?
Yes, great question. So this webinar was definitely designed for dairy farmers because the dairy farmers have the most complicated calculations to do, because they usually have more complicated rations that they're supplementing the pasture with. But yes, this exact same method would work for sheep or beef animals and for goats, and I've used this method for all of them. And there are no sheep or goat dry matter demand tables on the National Organic Program website right now, but 2 of the links in the previous slide will get you the dry matter demand numbers for sheep and goats. Then once you have those dry matter demand numbers, you're going to do exactly the same process where you calculate out the weight of what you're feeding them other than pasture on a dry matter basis per head per day. You subtract that from the total dry matter demand of that sheep or that goat. The difference is the estimated amount of dry matter from pasture, and then you can go on to calculate the percentage from pasture. And I'll just say it again because this is one of the steps that I am the most often to mess up, so I imagine other people are too. But it's the pounds of dry matter from pasture divided by the total dry matter demand, and then multiply that times 100. And so it's exactly the same process for sheep.
Okay, and related to the calculations, back to dairy cows, are separate calculations required, if different types or classes of animals are managed as one group and are all on the same feed ration? For example, if you have your heifers and your dry cows together on the same feed ration. Separate calculations?
Good question. And that is one of those questions that I think you should probably refer to your certifier. I'm hearing slightly different answers on that. In general, if the animals are significantly at a different stage of production or growth, so that they're eating a whole lot less or more dry matter in a day, you usually do have to do a separate calculation. But I've found in my experience when I'm actually on a farm, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do separate calculations for different groups if they're being housed together and fed together. And so I think that you should probably check that with your certifier to see which way they want you to do it. And I might start out by doing it just for the whole group. If you're concerned that maybe that group or part of that group might not be meeting the 30% rule, then to give yourself peace of mind, I would probably do those calculations separately. But if they're dry cows and bred heifers and the dry matter demand is pretty close for those two groups, then I would feel pretty comfortable just doing one calculation for the whole group. If it's very young heifers and dry cows, then I'd feel a little less comfortable about doing it as one group, and I'd probably ask my certifier.
Okay, great. This question says, does the dry matter composition of the same feed vary in different areas across the U.S.?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm glad you asked that. Yes, there are significant differences in the same type of feed, not only from one place in the country to another, but also just from between a first cut and a second cut, and also from year to year, just depending on the weather and the stage of maturity that the forage was harvested at, how much it was let sit in the field before it was harvested and stored. And so that is definitely one of the main reasons that we're encouraging farmers to actually test their own forages. And I think it's particularly important for those of you who are balancing rations that leaves you very close to the edge of just barely meeting the rule. If you're balancing a ration for one or more groups of animals on your farm where you're just barely over 30% dry matter intake from pasture, at that point, any sort of a math error or an assumption that you've made on the dry matter content of the feed or dry matter demand of the animals could push things in the other direction, and you'll end up with a group of animals that when you actually get inspected and your inspector and certifier check the dry matter intake calculations, you could be under 30% with that group of animals. And so it's particularly important for people in that position to actually test the forages as much as possible so you're using really accurate numbers that can't be questioned by the inspector or the certifier.
And does the rule regulate testing of forages?
It doesn't specifically talk about the testing of the forages, and so when you're doing the calculations and filling out your record sheets, whatever number you're using as the dry matter content of the feed, you'll just want to write down where you got that number. Was it from a forage test? Was it from a table that the certifier gave you? Or was it from a table that you got from the extension service or a nutritionist or something like that? So you keep track of the source of the information that you're using in these calculations.
Okay, so where could I find information about the specific groups that are exempted from the pasture rule besides the 0 to 6 month old calves?
Great question. So you'll find in the organic standards, in the rule section 205, 239, that's where most of those exemptions are going to be listed. And let's see, I think I've got it circled in my copy of the rule here on the table. If you download the copy of the actual organic standards pasture rule that's on the National Organic website, it is on page 155 of that version of the rule. If you've got a different version of the rule from your certifier or from a different website, then it won't be on the same exact page. But it is in section 205, 239, which is actually the housing living conditions section of the rule. And that's where there's a whole section starting with the letter B that lists all of the animals that are exempt from meeting the pasture rule. And they're very specific exemptions. There's exemptions in there for when your sheep need to be shorn, or there's an exemption in there if you have some animals on the farm that are being shown, going to shows and things like that. There's exemptions for sales. The bulls do not need to meet the pasture rule. Then there's the young stock, 0 to 6 months. There's exemptions at dry-off and at calving and a bunch of other exemptions in there that would be a good thing to keep track of. And that was something that was a little bit outside of today's presentation, but there will likely be some requirement of some record keeping for certain exemptions, but not all exemptions. So that's another area where you'll want to check with your certifier and see what sort of exemptions you need to keep to make sure that your certifier knows that you're using those exemptions correctly.
And so, Sarah, this is maybe a related question. Are finished beef calculations also noted in the NOP records regulations? I'm assuming the person's asking if finished beef are exempted?
Yeah, that is actually, I didn't cover that today because I was really focusing on dairy animals, but there is currently just one small section, it's the only section in the organic rule which is still under consideration. And so they've published an exemption for finished beef, but that may be discussed and changed. So that's something, if you have a group of beef animals on your farm, you'll want to stay tuned, keep an eye on the Natural Organic Program's website and see what the final decision is on the exemption for that final finishing stage of animals. Right now it is in there, and now I'm trying to remember which section of the rule that's in. Let me just take a quick peek here. Yeah, so that is also in 205-239, and it's the very last one. Ruminant slaughter stock. And so that's the piece that's still under consideration by the NOP. And I haven't heard within the last week or two whether there's been a final decision made on that, so I'm assuming that there hasn't been yet.
Okay. Okay, so next question is, when averaging the dry matter intake of each ration period, should you take into account the number of days that each ration was fed?
Great question. And I am assuming that this is a day-weighted average. This is one of the areas that I think at some point the NOP will give us some official clarification on this. I have heard that the NOP has told at least one certifier that it should be a day-weighted average, and that would be the most logical thing for it to be. So that would mean that, instead of just taking 3 dry matter intake calculations during the grazing season and just averaging those 3 numbers together, if you're doing a day-weighted average, you would actually take the number of days that you were providing 30% dry matter intake from pasture, or 50% dry matter intake, or 70% dry matter intake from pasture. You would want to know the number of days that you were feeding each of those 3 rations, and then you would take a day-weighted average of that. And this is one of the parts of the rule that I think we'll get clarification on at the end of this grazing season, when the certifiers and inspectors and farmers all have to sit down for the first time and do the averaging of all of the different dry matter intake calculations over the whole grazing season. And I'm hoping at that point that somebody will come up with a nice, easy-to-use table to do this day-weighted calculation on. I've just been doing it by taking the number of days that each of the rations are being fed and multiplying the number of days by that dry matter intake percentage, and then adding all of those different numbers together and then dividing it by the total number of days in the whole grazing season. I don't think that's something to very easily explain over the phone in a webinar. I feel like a table to do that really would make it much simpler. But the short answer to your question is yes, I think it will be a day-weighted average.
Okay. And then, Sarah, we're kind of running out of time here, but I just wanted to acknowledge there's a couple of questions about sort of determining dry matter. Let me see. I'm trying to. So dry matter, what would dry matter be at a grazing level of 2 inches type of question? Or from your experience, how many acres of pasture are needed to be available to meet the minimum dry matter intake requirements during the grazing season for milk cows? My sense is it depends, and that we'll be covering that more on October 1st? Exactly, yeah. That's a complicated answer to that question. It's a really important question. There is one article on the NOP website that will begin to get you some of the information. It's just going to be an introduction to that information.
I do have an article right now on my own personal website that does walk you through the process of doing paddock size calculations, and that'll be helpful to some of you. And then we're in the process of writing another longer article for the eOrganic website that will walk you through that entire process of figuring out how many acres do you need, how many paddocks, but we'll definitely be covering that on the October 1st webinar.
Okay, so I'm sorry, but we're out of time, but I'd like to thank you all for your questions. And as we mentioned before, this webinar is part of an ongoing series, so stay tuned for the September 16th and the October 1st webinars coming up. You can find information about these webinars and an archive of today's session, as well as the articles and videos that we've mentioned and more at eextension.org/organic_production. And I just wanted to remind you to respond to the follow-up survey that you'll receive by email shortly. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah, and thank you all for coming.